Alrighty, so here is our introductory lesson for Introduction to Forensic Science. Basically, we're going to be talking here out of the Chapter 1 introductory material. So one of the things that we need to figure out is really what is the objective, what is the goal of doing this CSI stuff? Well, our first thing is we want to figure out whether or not a crime actually was committed, which always sounds kind of funny, but I've investigated situations where folks have claimed that property was stolen, when in reality they had lent something to somebody else. They had borrowed it to somebody, and the friend, the neighbor, the cousin, the brother, whoever was just slow in returning it. And so it was just a matter of, hey, have you ever thought to call your friend, your loved one, whoever, and get your property back? Well, no, that never occurred to me. So no crime committed, no investigation there, let's just give them a call. Figuring out whether it's your jurisdiction to investigate. So all the time, folks who live outside the city limits come into the city, stop at the police department and say, hey, I need to speak to an officer. Very quickly figure out, well, actually, no, this happened someplace else. This is the county's problem. Or sometimes jurisdictional issues too, where we will find stuff, like the purse, or a bag of money or whatever laying on the side of the street that's been thrown out of a car. While yes, this was abandoned property in my jurisdiction, the actual bank that was robbed, the person that was robbed lives someplace else. The crime happened in some other jurisdiction, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. So we want to figure out whether or not we're actually within an area that we can investigate or whether we have to hand this case off to somebody else. Then we want to discover and document all the facts. We'll talk about that quite a bit during the semester. Identify our suspects and potentially eliminate the suspects. So when we start talking about fingerprints and DNA, we found this at the crime scene. So we have all these fingerprints and these DNA at the crime scene, and we suspect that Bob Smith is our suspect, and we run all the fingerprints and DNA, and Bob Smith doesn't come back as a match to any of those. Well, maybe Bob Smith actually didn't do this. Maybe for whatever reason he was on our radar as a suspect. It wasn't a very good reason, so we can move on. Locate and apprehend that perpetrator eventually once we identify a suspect and narrow it down to one person it might be. Let's go out, find them, arrest them, and get them into court. And if we're going to go to court, we have to have this thing called the chain of custody of evidence. We'll speak about this quite a bit this semester, but that is the idea that when I pick up a piece of evidence at the crime scene, I know every person who has touched it until we get to court. So, if this thumb drive here is something that was picked up at a crime scene, I'm going to know exactly who has touched this thumb drive from now until the day we are in court. So whether I put this on a shelf in the evidence room, whether I hand this off to another officer who then puts it in the evidence room, if I send this to the crime lab and they test it and send it back to me, I have a record of everybody who has touched this, so I can say that nobody's tampered with it. And then when I go to court, I'm testifying, and I'm going to be able to testify as an expert and an expert in my field. So that when I tell the jury that, this person is our suspect and this is why we went forward with probable cause to arrest, these are all the facts I know, and reasonably I can say that they did it. And then it's up to them to weigh all the evidence. So when we talk about weighing the evidence, we've got two types of evidence: testimonial evidence and physical evidence. Testimonial evidence is words, statements. So when I talk to witnesses, when I talk to victims, when I talk to suspects, all the stories that they tell me of what they saw, the who, what, where, when, why, and how. Testimonial evidence then gets entered into quote-unquote evidence when we go into court and you swear to tell the truth, told truth, and nothing but the truth, so help me God. And now I say what I said to the police on the stand, or I should say my witness or my victim says what they told me as an officer when they're up there on the stand. So that's our testimonial evidence. We gather that in the field, we document it, and then that allows people to testify in court later on. That's really not the objective of this course, so we're probably not going to talk a whole lot more about testimonial evidence after this slide. That the rest of the semester we're talking about physical evidence, actual things we can bring into court, people's fingerprints, bloodied clothing that has been tested for DNA, photographs. Our physical evidence can be both demonstrative and the actual physical item. So our photographs, reports, copies of people's credit histories, all those kinds of things are physical items that we can bring in and show to the jury and send to the crime lab for testing. Some of the things physical evidence can do for us in no particular order here. It can prove that a crime was committed. When somebody says that they've been beaten up and they have no bruises, were they really beaten up? Oh wait, they have a black eye. So yes, we have physical evidence there. They have been in a fight. Just think about what happened here with the Olympics and the young man who reported being robbed. And, people do sometimes report that they're victims of crimes, and they're not victims of crimes. We can identify the identity of people, so fingerprints, DNA, other records, other ways of identifying people. We can put two people in connection with each other, so put our suspect at the crime scene, put our suspect in connection with our victim. We can clear the innocent, like I said before. If we've got fingerprints and they don't match one of our suspects, that means that they're not a suspect anymore. Oftentimes when we do have somebody's fingerprints at the crime scene, that's a pretty good way for them to, give or a pretty good reason for them to give a confession to say, yes, I did it, and hope that they can get a lighter sentence. Court decisions become very important on it. We are going to talk about something called the CSI effect next week, and that is a issue here where juries expect to see evidence, and sometimes we have court cases that we have lost, and I personally have lost a court case involving fraud, person writing checks without any money in their bank account. And the whole reason that the jury found the person not guilty was because we hadn't fingerprinted the checks. And their attorney said it was possible somebody had stolen their checkbook and wrote those checks. And then also when we don't have evidence, that's always kind of interesting. We have smart criminals these days who will wipe surfaces down to make their fingerprints go away, who will clean up after themselves. So when we talk about whether or not somebody had the intent or the plan to commit a crime, if they have deliberately removed all the physical evidence from the scene, that shows some of their intent, some of their deliberate tries at hiding their involvement in this crime. Big thing that we are going to talk about is the scientific method. And, fictional detective kind of got us on this path. Sherlock Holmes said, it's a capital mistake to theorize before you have all the evidence. It biases your judgment. The example I always give for this. All right, so you get called to a scene of a quote-unquote suicide. You arrive on scene, there's a body laying on the floor, there's a hole in their head that is bleeding, and there is a gun laying next to their body. Dispatch told you this is a possible suicide because that's what the person who called 911 said. You walk in and people start talking about suicide, and you have a person with a hole in their head and a gun close to their body. Is it probably a suicide? No. Right now it's a death scene. You don't have any evidence. But because you are starting to theorize and you are starting to buy into this theory of suicide, you would be biased towards that. And you think about how easy it is for loved ones to get in close to each other, and you are statistically more likely to be killed by a family member than a stranger. It's very easy to shoot a loved one in the head, not to scare anybody. But this is what the scientific method looks like. Recognize we have a problem, define that problem, collect the data, analyze the data, develop a hypothesis, test the hypothesis, and select a hypothesis. We have a crime scene. What kind of crime are we looking at? Do we have stuff missing? Do we have a person dead? Collect the data, let's collect all the evidence, analyze it, taking a look at it, ourselves, send it to the crime lab, etc. Based on information that we have, who is our suspect? Check against alibis. If that suspect doesn't have an alibi, if crime lab testing shows that their fingerprints are at the crime scene, boom, we got it. So that's the scientific method right there. Facts first, assumptions later. Collect the evidence, check out the evidence, look at it from all the angles, look at other people's statements and alibis, look at it from all the angles, and if we can show everything lines up, that is our final hypothesis, and that is when we go and get arrest warrants. Collection and preservation of evidence. We'll talk a lot about these kinds of things. Make sure that you're using the appropriate means for collecting evidence. If you don't collect it right, it is tainted. Make sure that we have permission to be collecting evidence or that we have a warrant. Don't think that it's not a big deal, because if you collect evidence improperly, we have something called fruit of the poisonous tree, and that means if this evidence got us information, all the next layers of evidence all go away. So that first thing, it's kind of like, that game Jenga. You take out the wrong piece and the whole tower falls down. So you pull out one piece of evidence and our whole case falls apart. Be cognizant of contamination, wearing your gloves, wearing face mask, wearing eye protection, all the stuff that you don't see the folks on CSI do all the time, making sure that we're doing that, and that whole chain of custody of evidence. I already kind of got ahead of myself and talked about this, but the chain of custody of evidence is that list of everybody who has touched the evidence. And I said, I want to make sure that I know who's touched it so it couldn't have been tampered with. Some important considerations, things we don't see on a lot of TV shows. There's a legal duty to preserve evidence. So I have a case, I don't have a suspect, but 10 years from now, we might develop a suspect. So the old adage of cold cases and maintaining evidence for a long time, because we could end up solving a crime. And we are seeing cold cases that are decades old being solved now, and people who we thought would never go to jail or prison are now going to jail or prison and answering for the crimes. Collect enough evidence. You can never collect too much evidence. Making sure that using the proper collection and preservation techniques. Don't half-ass it, pardon my French. And also recognizing sometimes too what is not evidence. We talk about the quantity of evidence, collect enough, but there's a flip side to that. You can collect too much and you can overburden your evidence room on having stuff that doesn't need to be saving. Big thing, teamwork. We don't work in a void, we don't work in a vacuum. It's not like on TV where the folks go to the crime scene and they're there all by themselves and they're talking to themselves and talking to the evidence. No, we go in there as a team, and as a team we work together. No one person is important than the other person on a team, and our job is not to solve the crime. Our job is to document the facts, and it's not who solves the crime, it's the team's work. It's a we attitude, and it's not a me, it's a we. We worked this case, we did this, we solved this crime. Making sure that all of our members are trained, making sure that all of our members are keeping up on their training is very, very important. The things that we're looking for. Got to have a little bit of intuition. Got to have that gut instinct. Sometimes we talk about the hair on the back of the neck that stands up. If you get into a situation and something doesn't feel right, that you understand that you listen to those gut instincts. Eye for detail. You got to be looking out for the small things. Got to be looking out for stuff that it doesn't look right, that doesn't add up. We communicate well, verbally and written. So I'm going to be a big stickler in case you didn't miss it. The discussion boards. You got to write me full college essays, beginning, middle, end, introduction, body information, and then a conclusionary statement. Separating these things out into separate paragraphs even. So I want some good discussion postings because I need to tell your future employers that you're good communicators, because everything we do gets written down in investigative reports. We need to know how to locate evidence. We need to know how to preserve that evidence, and we need to keep up on this, because I can tell you when I started, not a lot of people had computers, and there was no such thing as smartphones. We had cell phones, but not smartphones. And so now that everybody has computers and everybody has a smartphone, how we collect evidence has changed for some of those electronic devices, and you got to keep up on these things. So continuing education becomes very important. All right. So any of those of you who are forensic science majors versus the CJ majors taking the forensic science class for their forensics credit, there are some professional associations you can look into. Those of you who see CSI as being a career path for you, take a look at the IAI, the International Association of Identification. They put out a lot of good information about what the job of a CSI is, and they're constantly researching and certifying new techniques. EPIC is for our photographic people, the Evidence Photographers International Council. My background is one of both being a police officer and having worked in the fire service and been a fire investigator. So I'm a big fan of the International Association of Arson Investigators. They're the people who certify our fire and arson investigators. For folks who like things involving reconstruction, we have the Association of Crime Scene Reconstructionists, and then also for the technology and computer gurus, we have the High Technology Crime Investigation Association. There are literally hundreds of these professional associations, and when you look back at the last slide where we say enjoys continuing education, this is part of our continuing education efforts, is being members of these organizations. They send out magazines and newsletters and journals all the time. So please, as you're moving forward, getting closer to a career, check out some of these different professional organizations. Do a Google search for professional associations, for law enforcement, for forensics. See what's out there, and you never know, they might help you with some of your job search. Most all of these pages have job boards. So those of you who are looking for jobs or will be looking for jobs shortly, check out these groups. They will have some interesting job listings for you. All right, so until next week, if anybody has any questions, make sure you email or give me a phone call. I'm always around, and I am always happy to answer students' questions.